Hello, this is Theodore Holden in Southeast Texas, and I want to talk about Immanuel Velikovsky, um, Venus, the morning star, the planet, and a couple of major cosmic level catastrophes which occurred after the flood, a number of centuries after the flood. And you still have a number of people, you know, Christians particularly, who would like to believe that the Earth is 5, 6, 7,000 years old, something like that, right? You originally had this Bishop Ussher who added up like chronologies from the Old Testament and arrived at a conclusion that the Earth and the universe itself were no more than a few thousand years old, about 6,000, somewhere around there. And and the most major way that people would normally argue against that, I mean, scientists, is to claim that light coming to us from distant galaxies is taking, gigantic amounts of time to get here, right? And they assume that that time is real. They're assuming that that light is traveling in the form of waves from the distant galaxies to the Earth, to us, at the speed which we observe light waves to travel. Nonetheless, in another video, I've mentioned the likelihood that while the light waves that we see here, which are being generated in our local environment, may be traveling at a rate of speed which is like from here to the moon in 1 second. Okay, that seems fast to us standing on Earth, right? But if you're talking about having light try to reach us from distant galaxies, that's not very fast. That's going to take giant amounts of time. Um, and nonetheless, what seems to be the case is that, like, the particles which are causing those waves are traveling at a very much greater rate of speed than that. I mean, a velocity which would get you from, this would be the computed necessary velocity of subelectron particles, subtron particles, which would get you from here to Andromeda in a couple of seconds, right? So, you're not talking about, if that turns out to be the case. Now, I've produced a video which is called the redneck theory of light, the machine gun analogy. And if that's correct, and I believe that it is, then the light that we see coming from distant galaxies is not taking eons to get here. It's taking a few seconds or a few minutes. Um, so, what else might there be in the way of something to demonstrate that the Earth is more than 5 or 6 or 7,000 years old, right? And the most major thing that I would point out to somebody would be the planet Venus, which is completely different from the other rocky bodies in our system. So you've got the planet Venus, and as recently as the late 1950s, what was being taught was completely different from from what we know to be the case now. People, evolutionists and whatnot, believe in deep time, right? They believe that our system and all of the bodies in it are roughly the same age, that, very, very old, like hundreds of millions or billions of years. And like I said, that's what was being taught. And if you believe that, then you would believe that from their location in the system, that Earth and Venus are sister planets. That's what was being taught in the late 50s, was that Earth and Venus were sister planets, that they would have similar histories, and that due to the location in the system, at a given latitude, Venus would be maybe 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the Earth is, right? That's what was being seen in books on the subject. Like, I remember seeing that and reading that, like in the late 50s. And then, like in the mid 1960s, you began to get a completely different picture. We began to have real ways of measuring and reading the conditions on Venus. What it turns out is that the surface temperature on Venus would melt lead. You're talking about 850 degrees Fahrenheit or thereabouts. You could touch a piece of paper to that and it would catch fire. Um, you've got a 90 bar CO2 atmosphere. That means that a 2-mile-an-hour wave would knock you over the same way that a wave at the beach does. You know, a wave at the beach is not coming in at 50 or 100 miles an hour. It's moving in at 1 or 2 miles. The water's moving at 1 or 2 miles an hour, but it's just dense enough that it doesn't take any more than that would knock somebody over. Now, the same thing is true of the atmosphere of Venus. I mean, even if you didn't get burned to cinders, the first second you were on the place, right? It's like, just any kind of a 2-mile-an-hour wind would knock you over. You wouldn't be able to stand up. Okay, you've got a massive thermal imbalance. The planet radiates a great deal more energy than it takes in from the sun. You've got a massive upwards infrared flux. You've got a total lack of regolith. I mean, there's no dirt on Venus. And everything that we know about Venus is what you would expect from a new planet. Okay, what that says is that Venus, by all appearances, is basically a new planet which has not had time to cool. And that's what we're seeing now. That's not the official position that that our science journals and whatnot espouse and give out. The official position is something which I consider to be completely idiotic, which is Carl Sagan's super greenhouse theory. Now, what that amounts to is a claim that you've got sunlight coming to Venus, and you've got some tiny modicum of that sunlight which makes it all the way through the cloud layers as ultraviolet light, and then cannot re-radiate as infrared because of the thick cloud layers. If that were the case, then you would expect some light to be detectable in the middle cloud layers of Venus. It isn't. There's no measurable light in the middle cloud layers. What you get is pitch black in the middle cloud layers, and then light increasing in brightness as you get down towards the surface, so that the light at the surface is being generated locally. The light that you see on the surface of Venus is being generated by intense electrical processes and by chemical reactions which are related to those processes. Ignatius Donnelly was a kind of a Renaissance man and an American politician from Wisconsin back in the 1870s, 1880s, who wrote a couple of books on recent prehistory, right? One book was called Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, and he came very close to putting together the same story that Immanuel Velikovsky eventually put together in the 1940s and 50s. Okay, so that you've got two cases of somebody putting this story together, working from nothing much more than ancient literature and an analysis of comparative mythology. And if that wasn't enough, then I believe that when you get to the 1960s and 70s, that you could put this together without without even looking at mythology. You could look at Venus, you look at the conditions that prevail there, and you would at some point you would realize that you were talking about a new planet which hadn't cooled, and you would come to the conclusion that this planet must have formed or been created very recently, and the humans must have seen this and watched it. Okay, and that there would be some sort of a record of these events in human literature, like in the Old Testament of the Bible and various other types of Greco-Roman literature, and it turns out that there is, right? In other words, if Immanuel Velikovsky hadn't existed, somebody would have to invent him. Okay, somebody would have to invent this story about Venus arriving or arising out of ex nihilo, right? I mean, out of nothing. And this is, in fact, what you read. This is what Immanuel Velikovsky put together. This book called Worlds in Collision talks about the historical record and about the various traditions involving Venus and the grief that Venus had caused after the floods. I've actually produced another video which is available on this channel, which talks about the flood and what exactly caused the flood. The flood did not involve sin, okay? It involved a dwarf star flare event. And the dwarf star flare event was brought about by the final capture of the Saturnian part of our system, right? Now, again, our solar system appears to be in two parts, maybe three, right? You've got the two bodies, which are Uranus and Pluto, which have oddball axis tilts. I mean, they may have some kind of a special weird story. They may, and come from our system in its original form as a Herbig Haro string, or they may come from outside of our system. No way to tell, right? But other than for those two bodies, everything else in our system was originally in one or the other of two groups, right? You've got a primordial group, which includes the Sun and Jupiter and Mercury and possibly a few other things, probably including our own moon. And these things have axis tilts less than 10 degrees, right? So that's what you would expect of a basic kind of a solar system. And then you've got this other group with the roughly 26 degree axes, or spin axes, right? You've got, from about 23 to about 28 degrees, right? And this includes Saturn, Neptune, Mars, and Earth, right? Those four bodies had to have been captured as a group, right? What I assume to be the case was that these bodies, they were still in this like inline electromagnetic alignment. They were not an orbiting system like our present solar system, and they flew into the plane of the Sun-Jupiter system from the south at a from the system south at a 26-degree angle. And as the individual bodies peeled out and began to orbit the way that they do now, ordinary gyroscopic force caused them to retain this 26-degree approach angle in the form of axis tilts. Okay, so you've got a question of this dwarf star flare event, which brought about the flood, being caused by the final capture of the dwarf star Saturn. The collisions of the electromagnetic sheaths of both the heliospheres of the Sun and the Saturnian system. And these events left both Venus and Mars in orbits which had dangerous points of near intersection with our own orbit. Okay, so that, not like every day or once a week or once a month even, every once in a while, you would get Mars or Venus too close to the Earth, and all hell would break loose. Okay, and this is the main catastrophe that, the catastrophe somewhere around, Velikovsky put it around 1500 BC, right, like 1500 years before Christ. Other scholars more recently have assigned different dates and time periods to this, nonetheless. You've got a major catastrophe, occurring after the flood, right? So I said previously that there were more than one global, cosmic disasters which have occurred within the history of our planet, some before the flood, some afterwards. Right, the flood was the most major, the most extreme such event that the Earth has ever experienced. Like I say, ancient literature contains references to these events. The book of Isaiah, chapter 14, amounts to a hymn of thanksgiving after Venus settled into a stable orbit. Let's take a look at that. Chapter 14, 14:4. 14:4 up through 14:15, 14:17 thereabouts, right? That thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased. And he's using the king of Babylon as a metaphor for Venus. Okay? The Lord hath broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He who, this is 14:6, he who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke, he that ruled the nations in anger is persecuted and none hindereth. Okay, like I say, this is a hymn of thanksgiving after Venus settled into a stable orbit. And the whole earth is at rest and quiet, and they break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees, 14:8, rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since thou art laid down, no feller is come up against us. Health from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming. It stirreth up the dead for thee, even all the chief ones of the earth. It hath raised up from their thrones all the kings of the nations. All they shall speak and say unto thee, art thou also become weak as we? Art thou become like unto us? That's 14:10. Thy pomp is brought down to the grave, and the noise of thy violins, I guess, the worm is spread unto thee, and the worms cover thee. Talking about Venus again. You know, something which had been an object of terror from the time of the flood, roughly up until somewhere after the times of Exodus and the book of Joshua, right? Look, how art thou, this 14:12, this is the key to it. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning star. Lucifer was a common word used for Venus in ancient times. How art thou cut down to the ground, which didst weaken the nations? It's 14:12. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend unto heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. It's 14:13. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit. They that see thee, 14:16, they that see thee shall narrowly look upon thee and consider thee, saying, is this the man that made the earth to tremble, that did shake kingdoms? 14:16, that made the world as a wilderness and destroyed the cities thereof, that opened not the house of his prisoners. That's 14:17. Okay. And that's as far as you need to go with that. That made the earth as a to tremble, that did shake kingdoms, right? That made the world as a wilderness. Okay, so he's talking about that, and Immanuel Velikovsky describes this giant catastrophe which occurred, on this most major occasion where the Earth got too close to Venus, and aside from everything else, this is the best description of the plagues of Egypt that you'll ever come across. I don't believe that there are natural explanations for every kind of thing that you read in the Bible. There are, in the case of Israelites, there are too many cases where the Israelites come up on the positive side of some kind of a thing like this. I mean, it doesn't figure to be just by chance. Okay, you have things in which there's no naturalistic explanation in the Bible. The catastrophe which Immanuel Velikovsky described in Worlds in Collision was not as grandiose as the flood at the time of Noah, but it was still a global event. It was still something which everybody in the world saw, so that other nations have their own versions of the story. The Egyptians, for instance, told that story in the form of a tale of Ra, which to them meant Jupiter, and the Eye of Ra, which meant Venus, and of Ra sending his eye to destroy mankind on Earth. Okay, and in the books which were published by Dr. Wallace Budge, in the late 1800s. The story is called The Destruction of Mankind. Okay, at any rate, aside from everything else, what we see from these stories about Venus and from the conditions on Venus is that we have a way of refuting the claim that the Earth is like 5 or 6 or 7 thousand years old. The Earth is substantially older than that. In other words, we have a planet which actually is ballpark for some kind of a 5 or 10,000 year age estimate, and we know what that looks like, and the Earth simply doesn't look like that. So that's it for today. Take care.